So, as the year is stretching out a little bit now, after Pesach, I find a little bit of time to start going back into some of the areas that I had previously worked on. We're back to Jewish Astrology of Cosmic Science, a fantastic sefer that's written by YAAKOV KRONENBERG. There's his name written right here. I recommend that anybody who really is interested in this subject to buy this book. We've been hundreds of years of understanding that in Judaism there is a very definite attitude towards the planets, how they move, how they have influence upon us. You just have to look at the names of the Jewish months, and we've been through a lot of this. So now we're going to come over to a new section in this idea. And we're going to read a little bit over here, if I can find my pencil. Pencil? Oh, anybody? Pencil. Got my pencil. So this goes like this. It starts like this. This is a little different print than he's had previously. Try to get this down a little bit lower so we can see a little bit better. This is a piece which calls Philosophy and the History of Jewish Astrology by YAAKOV KRONENBERG. Now he says this is a transcription of a lecture. What he had apparently was, at the time when he was actively doing this, he had someone who would take his lectures and then transcribe them into English, or just transcribe them into book form. So this is a lecture on the astrology of prediction as compared to the astrology of psychology. Now we know that astrology deals with what we call the Midos, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, 7 planets, and Malchus. All of them have an impact on us in terms of Midos in the psychological sense. But he wants to say that he wants to talk about being mazel-oriented. He says, mazel-oriented, what does mazel-oriented mean? He says a prediction, a science of prediction, compared to Western astrology. Also, how Torah astrology differs from Indian astrology. The introduction here, it's entitled Philosophy and History of Jewish Astrology by YAAKOV KRONENBERG. I'll talk about really the philosophy and history of Jewish astrology because I think I'm the first person, at least that I know of, that is really going into Jewish astrology. Until now, really, if you look around the last 20 to 25 years, and I'm not sure exactly when he wrote this, but it had to be like 15, 20 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I'm not sure. In the astrology world, there have been a movement back to ancient texts. It started, on one hand, from a lot of guys from America, women too, actually, and they went off to India. And they learned Indian astrology, which was until then, I remember in the early 70s, and I remember he's going back into his youth. I tried to learn Indian astrology books by myself, and even with a translation, it was impossible to understand. You couldn't understand it. And so these guys then went off to India. They had long hair, they were hippies, who knows what, and they went off there, and they grew out of the American of the 60s and the early 1970s. And they took off to India, and they went around until they found teachers. And in India, a lot of the people are English-speaking, of course. The educated class especially, because at one time it was ruled by Britain, so it was like the second language there, English, the Queen's English. And so they went around, and they were able to find really top teachers. They really knew their material, and they took knowledge and they brought it back to America, and they wrote books, and really they opened up Indian astrology for Americans. You know, for Western speakers, so that's what he means. So that was on hand, so that was on one hand. On the other hand, they have a very rich tradition in astrology in India. I mean, it goes back, maybe a couple of thousand years. I don't want to say much more about this, but I can show maybe a little later on the connection between Vedic, which is Indian astrology, and Jewish astrology. There's a tradition that a lot of the stuff from the East, actually our tradition is that they came from us. But we will wait on that for now, because I first want to give you a little bit of introduction about what's leading me to do what I'm doing today. So he says, let me just move this up so we can get some more onto this, and maybe I can get it focused a little bit better. Yeah. So he says, so anyway, these people, they all came back from India. They wrote books and brought down all these new techniques, a lot of which nobody knew about. The Dashi system, time periods, and all different kinds of things. Different ways of interpreting the chart. And anyway, I don't want to go into that now. My job is not to teach Indian astrology. I think if you want to learn Indian astrology, there are better people to learn it from than me. But I'm here to talk about the difference between Indian astrology and Jewish and Western astrology. Now, he's put three things in the mix: Indian astrology, Jewish astrology, and then the Western astrology. What they have in difference, and what they have in common. So anyway, I want to give background material first and show how there was a movement really to bring back the ancient astrology. Because what happened in the early 1900s with the advent of Freud and psychology and psychoanalysis, so this had a big impact, he wants to say, on Western astrology. So anyway, the Western astrology became very psychoanalytically oriented in the 1900s and later on, really until the 1970s even. It became totally like psychological astrology. You call it like psychological astrology. I'm going to bring this down a little bit closer here. So let me do something else also. There we go. Because what happened in the early 1900s with the advent of Freud and psychology, psychoanalysis. So anyway, the Western astrology became very psychoanalytically oriented in the early 1900s and later on, really until the 70s. That's where I was. Okay. It became totally like psychological astrology. That's interesting for me because, and in my time that I learned with YAAKOV KRONENBERG. So he wants to make sure you know that he's not a rabbi, he doesn't paskin shilas, he's an astrologer, even though he's a tremendous Kabbalist. He says the early 1900s and later on until the 1970s even. Now, I myself, before I became religious, was a doctoral student in clinical psychology. So to get to that point, you have to know a lot of psychological ideas, and Freud and Jung, and going to the Adler, and many different peoples of my era that were teaching psychological principles. It became totally like psychological astrology. The astrologer would spend most of the time dealing with people's psychological problems and giving him a psychological profile. And not too much talking about prediction. Because they didn't really know how to predict, and they had a philosophical idea that people had total free will in a certain way, and in a certain way, it was good to, I'm not sure that I got this grammar right. He said because they didn't really know how to predict, and they had a philosophical idea that people had total free will. And in a certain way, it was. Not good, not good to predict. A very difficult sentence. You're talking, so he says, you're taking away the person's free choice. So if you say that, so I'm not sure exactly what he's supposed to say, that people should have free will. So you could change, I guess, your nature, change your midos, work on yourself, and things will change for you. So he says, you're talking about the person's free choice. I don't know whether, and it became very psychoanalytically and analytically oriented, psychologically oriented. And there was naturally a revolt against that because really the job of the astrologer has always been to predict the future. Now, this is a picture, I guess we got through that little, this is not always grammatically perfect. He's not 100% and never will be 100%. That is the ability to predict. If he was 100%, there would be no need for prophets. So good astrology, maybe 70% of the time, he could be right. Now, this is a basic principle that Rabbi YAAKOV has brought out in this Sefer, is that Jewish astrology is not meant to be 100% right. It's very close. He could make good predictions. He could be very good in seeing trends and things like that. But he's certainly no prophet. If you want prophecy, you go to the Bible. That's where it was just full of prophecy. And you see it all came true. And they were predicting things 2,000 years ahead of time. Look in the Jewish Bible. It says the Jews were going to be exiles. They were going to live in all amongst the nations, in all, I guess it means all among the nations. I should think it should be in all of the nations. And then eventually they were going to be brought back to Israel. And in our generation, you see it before your very eyes. A prediction that was made 2,000 years ago, not in cryptic language like Edgar Cayce or Nostradamus, that if you want to play around with it, you can come to any understanding that you want. But they predicted things really out in the open in the Bible. And look, that's going out on a limb. If you're just starting a religion and you want to get followers, you need to be careful not to make predictions that's not going to come true. And really, if you look through the Jewish Bible, you will see prediction after prediction that they weren't afraid to make, and you see it all came true. But again, prediction, that I guess is, but again, that's not my job. If anyone wants to go to places where they can talk about things like this, I'd be happy to direct them. Just send me a letter or an email, and I'll answer them. And maybe later on we could do a series on Jewish prophecy. I think that would be an interesting idea. We could talk about all different prophecies in the Bible, and we could show you how they came true and how they were on the mark, but we will come back to that also. So he says, in any case, besides all these guys going off to India to learn Indian astrology, there was also a lot of people in the West who decided to look back into the tradition. That is, they went back to a movement which was trying to revive old astrology books from Greece and Romans and from the Middle Ages. They took from Arabic, Persian, all these different places were full of astrological texts. You name it, they were looking for it. Babylonian, even lately, they have been coming out with Babylonian texts. And they've been trying to go back into the early history and coming up with new old techniques to try to explain what was going on in the world of astrology back then and try to use these techniques in today's world. But of course, it's very interesting that there was nothing or very little on Judaism actually, on the Jewish approach to astrology, that is. And I think tonight I want to show you really all of what I think is going to be a short piece, but very interesting. I want to answer a lot of problems of the Western approach to astrology, to the history of astrology. But in any case, you see that they also go back. But in Jewish astrology is very little, almost nothing. Let's put it that way. There is almost zero on Jewish astrology. On one hand, it's maybe a dearth for people who have knowledge of Judaism and Jewish religion, because astrology is, well, all books on Judaism, any book on Judaism up until maybe 100 years ago or so, were written by rabbis. Let me see where I'm at here, if I got too far into this. Religious rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, some of it or part of it in Old Hebrew, some of it in Aramaic. A lot of it isn't even in Hebrew. It's in an Aramaic, which itself has a few different dialects. So there weren't too many people that were conversant in astrology. As we know that it's very difficult to get an astrological text, a Jewish text on astrology. But we have one here. They knew these ancient languages and also knew their way around the Jewish religion and could learn the Jewish sources, so there was almost no revitalization of Jewish astrology to any degree, and really The only thing that I've seen really as one or two basic texts, they're the books of Ibn Ezra, who's a great rabbi, tremendous genius, a tremendous scholar. But his astrology is very much Western astrology. It's more or less what we call Ptolemaic astrology in origin, similar to Greek astrology, and I'll show you why later in my talk. And why it is that way, because you see, they really have one source, and they just got split off at a certain point. But we'll talk about that. Let me get this lined up a little bit better. There we go. So he says, but we will talk about that, but Ibn Ezra has been translated. There are few different people translating it now, actually. I forget their names, though. There's a professor from Bar-Ilan University who has been translating a number of his books recently, maybe 4 or 5 of them, but he is selling them at university prices, small books and quite expensive. But in any case, Ibn Ezra, I don't think encompasses the whole field, really, of Jewish astrology. I would guess it is basically a Western textbook on astrology. Now, up to this time, I'm reading what Reb YAAKOV is saying. I still don't have any feeling at all for the differences between Indian, Western astrology and Jewish astrology. So he said, these books were very well written, very knowledgeable, very good, but he doesn't cover a lot of the groundwork in Jewish astrology. And besides him, there is really almost nothing. So I felt that it's my job to bring back some of the old stuff and try to teach it on the website. And it's a little bit hard because the rabbis didn't really engage per se in astrology. That's not really what the rabbis were about. You know, they are rabbis and their job is to teach Torah. Their job isn't to teach astrology, so they dealt in it, but they dealt in it in a not so much systematic way. Maybe I have 10 or 15 books that are dealing totally with astrology, some of them very old, going way back. Then most of the stuff is all hidden here and there, and you have to really look around to find it because it's like they knew medicine back then. The rabbis knew medicine, but they didn't write medical books. It wasn't their avoda. It wasn't their job. It wasn't what they were doing. They were osek in Torah and teaching Torah. It wasn't their job. The same way they knew, say, for botany, or they knew other sciences, and you see this, how the understanding of the physical workings of the world is very deep with the rabbis. Say astronomy, they wrote a little about it, but they had to know astronomy in order to write it, because a lot of Jewish religion, the times of the Jewish religion, the times of the holidays, depend on knowing astronomy. So they knew astronomy. Per se, they didn't write a whole lot on astronomy because of books over the years. They wrote a few, but mostly in order to teach people the basics of astronomy. So they could use it to figure out the Jewish holidays, the Jewish years, things like that. And so it was the same thing for astronomy per se, and then astrology, since it wasn't a topic that they were keenly interested in writing about. But anyway, this is a lot of rich literature on astrology in Judaism. I want to bring back a lot of it. And we will talk about it over the next, some amount of time. You will see on my site there will be lots of classes, and I hope people will read them. So let's now start to get back into the lecture tonight that he wants to talk about. And we're going to stop this shiur here. That's an introduction to what Reb YAAKOV KRONENBERG wants to say. And in the next year, God willing, we'll be able to look at it in more detail.